The morning sun was bright, painting the streets of Mountain View with a golden glow. Sundar Pichai stepped out of his car in a simple shirt and worn-out sneakers. He had left his official suit and driver behind, wanting for once to blend in. To feel the rhythm of the company he built without the walls of power surrounding him. For weeks he had been restless, sensing a quiet shift among employees. A gap between leadership and the people who worked day and night in those glass towers. He wanted to see it with his own eyes. No assistants, no badges of power, just himself. Walking as a stranger into his own kingdom. But as he approached the googleplex entrance, the first twist of the day caught him off guard. A new security guard, young and serious, stepped in front of him. "Sir, you can't enter without a badge." The voice was firm but not rude. Sundar smiled politely, explaining he was an employee and had forgotten his badge at home. The guard shook his head unmoved. "Rules are rules. No badge, no entry." Sundar laughed softly, thinking it was a small misunderstanding that would resolve in seconds. But when he mentioned his name, expecting recognition, the guard's expression didn't change. In fact, he looked even more suspicious, as though Sundar was an imposter trying to sneak into the office inside. Through the glass doors, Sundar could see the life of Google engineers rushing with laptops. Teams huddled around coffee tables, the hum of creativity. Yet here he was, the CEO, standing powerless outside like a stranger. Part of him wanted to pull out his phone, make a single call, and end the embarrassment. But another part of him, stubborn, curious, maybe even hopeful, wanted to see how far this would go. If this was how ordinary employees or visitors were treated, perhaps it revealed something deeper about the culture he had sworn to protect. Got minutes turned into an hour. Sundar sat on a bench near the entrance, ignored by employees walking past. Some glanced at him, wondering who the man with tired eyes and no badge was. A few whispered, assuming he was a rejected applicant or maybe even a protester. No one recognized him without the aura of his position. And in that invisibility, Sundar felt something he hadn't felt in years, what it was like to be unseen. Unheard, dismissed just when he thought of ending the little experiment, a commotion stirred near the lobby. A senior manager walked by, arguing loudly with a junior employee. The manager accused her of being late, mocking her in front of everyone. Sundar's eyes narrowed. He saw the humiliation on the young woman's face, her trembling hands gripping her laptop. No one defended her. People walked faster, pretending not to notice. The guard who had denied Sundar entry didn't move either, as if cruelty was just another part of the day. A storm brewed in Sundar's heart. He wanted to step in, to reveal who he was, to protect the girl from further insult. But his mind whispered, "Not yet. Wait, watch." He realized this was bigger than him being denied entry. This was about the very soul of the company. As the young woman wiped her tears and walked away, Sundar stood again, his jaw tight. He decided he wouldn't leave. He would stay outside until he understood everything, until he saw the truth behind. The smiles, the slogans, and the glossy posters about kindness and inclusion. He would see his company not as its CEO, but as a man denied entry, forced to feel what others felt. And then, just as he turned to sit back down, a group of employees exited the building. One of them pointed at him and said loudly, "Isn't that the guy who's been sitting here for hours?" "Security, are you sure he's not a threat?" The guard stiffened, eyeing Sundar with new suspicion. Before Sundar could respond, 2 more guards arrived and asked him to leave the premises. Their voices were sharper this time, their eyes colder, and as Sundar took a slow breath, he realized his day had just turned into something far more dangerous and revealing than he had planned. Asterisk, the 2 guards who arrived stood tall and rigid, their presence commanding the space around Sundar. One of them had a clipboard tucked under his arm, while the other held his hand close to the radio clipped on his belt, ready to call in backup if needed. Sundar felt the weight of their eyes, sharp and suspicious, as though he were not a man who had built one of the most powerful companies on earth, but an intruder daring to step too close to its gates. "Sir," We've been asked to request you. Leave the premises, the guard with the radio said firmly. His tone carried no room for negotiation. Sundar took a deep breath, reminding himself to stay calm. He could have ended the entire ordeal in seconds, one phone call, one email, even a simple wave to someone who recognized him. But something inside held him back. He wanted to understand. He wanted to feel. So instead of fighting back with authority, he spoke with humility. I promise you, I'm not a threat. I used to work here and I just wanted to come in to see some of my colleagues. I forgot my badge. The guards exchanged glances, unconvinced. The one with the clipboard muttered, "That's what they all say." Sundar noticed how quickly they had placed him into a category, a faceless stranger trying to talk his way past security. There was no kindness in their eyes, no willingness to listen, only the rigid armor of rules and suspicion. Still, Sundar didn't budge. He asked gently if they could call someone inside to confirm his identity, maybe an assistant or even a manager. The guards shook their heads. We don't bother higher-ups with things like this. You'll need to leave or we'll have to escort you off the property. Sundar's chest tightened. Escort him off the property. The words echoed in his mind, like an insult, like a test of dignity. He wasn't angry for himself. He had long since shed the ego of position. But he thought about the countless others who might have faced this kind of treatment. Job applicants, coming for interviews, delivery workers dropping off packages, or young interns with nervous smiles who might have forgotten their badges. How many of them had been treated like this? Dismissed? Distrusted? Disrespected? Just then, the same young woman he had seen earlier, the one berated by her manager, walked out of the lobby again, clutching her phone. Her eyes were still red. Her steps hurried, but when she saw Sundar surrounded by security guards, something in her expression changed. She stopped in her tracks, hesitated, and then walked closer. Is everything okay here? She asked softly, her voice carrying a mix of curiosity and concern. The guards turned toward her, annoyed at the interruption. Everything's fine, ma'am, one of them said quickly. This gentleman was just leaving, but Sundar didn't move. He looked at her, and for a brief second, their eyes connected. She didn't recognize him as the CEO, but she recognized something else. His calmness, his quiet dignity, his refusal to raise his voice even when being mistreated. He's been here since morning, she said carefully. He doesn't look dangerous. Maybe we should, I don't know, just ask someone inside. The guard sighed, clearly irritated. Ma'am, with all due respect, this isn't your concern. Sundar saw her shrink back at those words, the same way she had shrunk under her manager's insults earlier. And it struck him like lightning. This wasn't about rules at all. It was about how people were treated when they had no power, when they had no titles, when they had no shield of recognition. He stepped forward slightly, his voice steady. I'm not going anywhere, he said. Not until someone comes and listens. Not until I see how this company really works when no one knows who I am. The guards stiffened. One reached for his radio, murmuring something about calling a supervisor. And Sundar felt the air tighten around him. A storm about to break. Before the supervisor could arrive. A small group of employees exited the building, laughing loudly about something on their phones. They noticed the scene immediately. One of them, a tall man in a hoodie with earbuds hanging around his neck, pointed at Sundar and scoffed. Wait a second. Is that guy still here? I saw him sitting on the bench this morning. Wow, he really doesn't have a life. His friends chuckled, and they walked past without a second thought. Sundar's heart sank. Not because of their words, he had endured worse in life, but because of how easily they had dismissed a stranger. The culture of a place, he realized, wasn't written in slogans or painted on walls. It lived in the smallest gestures, how people treated those who could give them nothing in return. As he stood there, an idea began to form in his mind. He wouldn't reveal himself yet. He would let the day unfold, let every mask slip, let every truth shine in the cracks of ordinary moments. He would become invisible on purpose. The supervisor finally arrived, a sharp-eyed man in a crisp shirt and polished shoes. He looked Sundar up and down with clear impatience. What seems to be the problem? The guards explained quickly, labeling Sundar as a man refusing to leave without a badge. The supervisor turned his attention to Sundar, his lips curling into a dismissive smile. Sir, I don't know what you're trying to pull here, but we don't tolerate loitering. If you don't leave in the next 2 minutes, I'll have no choice but to call the police. The word police cut through the air like a blade. The young woman who had spoken earlier gasped quietly. Sundar felt a mix of emotions, anger, sadness, and was all at once police at his own office. But instead of reacting with fury, he simply said, "Call them if you must. I'll be right here. I'm not leaving." The supervisor's eyes narrowed, the guards shifted uneasily, and the tension thickened like a storm cloud ready to burst. And in that charged silence, Sundar knew something life-changing was about to happen. Asterisk, the silence around the lobby stretched like a tightrope, ready to snap at the slightest movement. The young woman lingered by the glass doors, torn between, walking away and staying to see what would happen. The supervisor stood rigid, his arms crossed, as though he were preparing to crush a problem rather than solve it. The guards shifted from one foot to another, glancing between Sundar and their superior, unsure of what escalation might follow. Sundar, on the other hand, remained still. There was no anger on his face, no visible frustration. Instead, there was a quiet, unshakable calm that only grew stronger the more others tried to dismiss him. Deep inside, however, his mind was alive with questions. How did the culture of his company reach this point? When had it become so easy to dismiss, so quick to label? Had they all forgotten that behind every stranger was a story, behind every face was a human being? The supervisor pulled out his phone, his thumbs tapping rapidly. "I'll give you one last chance," he said, his tone sharp. "Leave on your own or I'll make the call. The police don't take kindly to people who refuse to follow rules." For a moment, Sundar thought of how ironic it was. Here he was, the CEO of Google, about to be arrested outside his own office. But instead of humiliation, a strange sense of clarity swept through him. Maybe this was the only way to truly understand what people went through when they had no authority, no badge of protection, no power to shield them. If he allowed this to unfold, it could reveal truths that numbers and reports never could. Before the supervisor could finish dialing, a voice broke through the tension. "Hold on. What's going on here?" Everyone turned. It was an older man, one of the building's maintenance workers, dressed in a faded uniform and holding a mop handle like a staff of authority. His face was lined with years of hard work, his eyes sharp with both wisdom and suspicion. He walked closer, squinting at Sundar as if trying to place him. "This man's been loitering without a badge." The supervisor replied quickly, eager to maintain control. "We've asked him to leave, but he refuses. We're about to call the police." The janitor frowned. "Police? For sitting outside?" he asked, his voice carrying a quiet weight. The supervisor shifted uncomfortably, annoyed by the interruption. "Rules are rules. We can't just let anyone in." But the janitor didn't look away from Sundar. He tilted his head slightly, studying the calmness in Sundar's expression, the steadiness in his posture. "You don't look like trouble," he said softly. "You look like a man who's waiting for something." Sundar's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. "Maybe I am," he replied gently. The janitor gave a small nod, then turned to the supervisor. Sometimes rules make sense. And sometimes they just make us forget we're human. Maybe you should ask before you judge." The words hung in the air like a quiet rebuke. The young woman by the glass doors felt a surge of courage from them, and she added hesitantly, "He really has been sitting here all morning. I don't think he means harm." For the first time, the supervisor faltered. He lowered his phone, but his pride wouldn't let him admit fault. "Fine. We'll wait a little longer," he muttered, glaring at Sundar as though his patience were being tested. But Sundar was no longer thinking about the supervisor. His attention was on the janitor and the young woman, The only two people who had seen him as human first, stranger second. And in their small acts of courage, he saw the flicker of the company's true spirit, a reminder that beneath the layers of rules and ego, kindness still lived on. Just then, the glass doors slid open again, and a group of executives stepped out. Their polished shoes clicked against the tiles, their expensive watches gleaming in the sunlight. They were laughing about something, and then their eyes fell on the scene. The supervisor straightened instantly, adjusting his tie. Everything's under control. He assured them quickly, gesturing towards Sundar. Just dealing with a situation. The tallest executive, a man with perfectly styled hair and a smirk that suggested entitlement, glanced at Sundar dismissively. What, another protester? We've had a few lately. He chuckled and added, funny how they think they can make a difference just by standing outside. Sundar's chest tightened. He stayed silent, but inside his heart was burning. This wasn't just about him being denied entry anymore. It was about the arrogance creeping into leadership, the blindness to empathy, the dangerous gap between those who had power and those who didn't. He thought about the engineers working late nights, the interns struggling to prove themselves, the janitors who kept the building clean but were invisible in the eyes of those executives. He thought about how easily leaders could lose touch with the reality of the people who built the company brick by brick, line of code by line of code. And as he stood there, silent but resolute, Sundar made a decision. He would not reveal himself not. Yet, he would let the day stretch longer, let the truth expose itself piece by piece. He wanted to hear more, see more, feel more. The executives walked away, their laughter fading into the distance. The supervisor sighed in relief as though danger had passed. But Sundar knew the real storm was just beginning, because at that very moment, the young woman received a message on her phone. Her face went pale as she read it. She looked at Sundar, then at the guards, and whispered in a trembling voice, "Something's happening inside, and you all need to see it." Asterisk, the young woman's trembling voice lingered in the air, almost swallowed by the sounds of traffic passing the googleplex. Her fingers clutched her phone so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Sundar watched her carefully, noting the way. Her eyes darted back toward the glass doors, as though what she had just read was too heavy to carry alone. "What is it?" The janitor asked gently, his voice steady. A grounding presence amid the tension. She hesitated, as if weighing whether or not to share. The guards rolled their eyes, clearly impatient with interruptions. The supervisor gave a curt shake of his head, muttering, "Probably nothing important." But the young woman's lips quivered, and finally she whispered, It's a message from my friend inside. Something's happening in the conference hall. An executive just fainted. They say people are panicking." Her words struck. Like a thunderclap. Everyone froze. Even the guards shifted uncomfortably, no longer able to dismiss her so easily. The supervisor frowned, pulling out his phone to check for updates. But nothing had come through official channels yet. Sundar's heart beat faster. He knew those conference halls. He had spent years in them, leading meetings that shaped the company's direction. They were large, crowded spaces, and when fear entered such rooms, it spread faster than fire. The young woman lowered her phone and added, she said it wasn't just fainting. He collapsed while giving a presentation, and others are saying, it's stress-related. People are shouting about overwork, about burnout. Some even walked out. A heavy silence followed. The janitor shook his head slowly, his eyes filled with sadness. Been saying for years, too much pressure in there. People treated like machines. Now it's boiling over. Sundar felt the words pierce straight into his chest. He had seen reports about stress and burnout, but in the clean language of charts and percentages, it always seemed like numbers on a page. Now it was no longer data. It was human, raw, and undeniable. Before anyone could respond further, the glass doors slid open again, and a flood of employees poured out. Some looked shaken, some angry, some whispering urgently to each other. The atmosphere had shifted from routine to chaos. One of them, a young man with sweat on his forehead, rushed past, muttering, "This place is falling apart. No one cares about us." Sundar stepped slightly to the side, trying not to draw attention, but every word echoed in his ears. "No one cares about us." The supervisor barked at the guards to manage the crowd, but even he seemed rattled. His earlier arrogance had faded, replaced by uncertainty. And in that moment, Sundar saw an opportunity. Instead of revealing his authority, he decided to blend into the chaos. He began asking quiet questions, approaching employees as though he were just another outsider concerned about what was happening. Many ignored him, but a few, too shaken to care who he was, spoke freely. Asterisk, "They push us too hard," one woman said, her voice trembling. "Deadlines, meetings, targets, nobody listens when we say we're exhausted. And then when someone collapses, they act shocked." "Management doesn't see us," another man muttered bitterly. "We're invisible until something goes wrong. Then suddenly it's our fault." Their words dug deep, more painful than any headline he had ever read. This was the truth, raw and unfiltered, spoken not in surveys or reports, but in the voices of people living it. The janitor stood nearby, nodding grimly at every complaint. "I've seen it too," he said quietly. "They walk past me every day like I don't exist, but I see them. I see the tired eyes, the late nights, the shoulders bent with pressure. Something's broken here." Sundar felt as though the ground beneath him was shifting. The very culture he had promised to build, the family he wanted Google to be, had cracks running through it so deep they threatened to swallow everything. Asterisk. As the crowd outside grew larger, the young woman who had first spoken up turned to Sundar again. "You've been here all morning," she said softly. "You've seen how they treated you. You've heard what people are saying." "Who are you? Really? Why are you staying?" Her question struck him harder than he expected. Who was he, if stripped of his title? A stranger at his own company? A man with no badge, no recognition, no authority? Or was he something else? Someone who needed to listen before he could lead again? Before he could answer, the sound of sirens pierced the air. 2 police cars pulled up, lights flashing, engines rumbling. The guards stiffened, the supervisor straightened his shoulders, and the crowd of employees fell into uneasy silence. The officers stepped out, their expressions serious. Scanning the scene, the supervisor wasted no time. He pointed directly at Sundar. "That's the man," he said loudly. "He's been refusing to leave, causing disruption." The officers walked toward Sundar, their footsteps heavy, their eyes narrowing with suspicion. The crowd whispered. The young woman gasped, and the janitor muttered under his breath, "Lord help us." And as the officers stopped just a few feet away, one of them asked in a cold voice, "Sir, do you have any identification?" Sundar took a slow breath. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of the moment. He knew this. Was it the point where everything could change? He looked into the officer's eyes, steady and calm, and said, "Yes, I do, but first let me tell you who I really am." Asterisk, the police officer's question hung in the air like a blade suspended. Above the scene, "Sir, do you have any identification?" His voice was clipped, detached, carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed without hesitation. The flashing lights painted the glass walls of the googleplex in streaks of red and blue, while the crowd of employees outside pressed closer, their whispers rising like the hiss of a storm. Sundar felt the weight of dozens of eyes on him, guards waiting for him to falter. The supervisor eager to see him removed, employees torn between fear and curiosity. The janitor stood quietly at the edge, his weathered hands resting on the mop handle like a staff, his gaze steady as if he already sensed there was more to the stranger than anyone realized. The young woman, who had been the only one to defend him earlier, looked at Sundar with a pleading expression, as if silently begging him to say something that would protect him from what was about to unfold. For a long, heavy moment, Sundar did nothing. His silence deepened the tension, and it was almost unbearable. In his mind, he weighed the choices. He could pull out his ID card from his wallet and end this entire ordeal within seconds. He could reveal that he was the CEO of the very company whose gates had just rejected him. The officers would snap to attention. The guards would stumble. Over apologies, and the supervisor's arrogance would crumble instantly. But something inside him resisted. Revealing the truth too soon would end the lesson, and he wasn't ready for that. Not yet, instead, he asked softly. Why does it matter so much who I am? The officer frowned, taken aback by the question. It matters because you're on private property without clearance. We've been told you refuse to leave. That's trespassing. Sundar nodded slowly. But what if I told you I belong here? What if I told you this place was built, in part, because of me? The crowd erupted in murmurs. Some laughed, thinking it was the delusion of a man desperate to avoid trouble. Others looked at him with a flicker of doubt, as though a shadow of recognition tugged at their memories but didn't quite take shape. The supervisor smirked and folded his arms. Here we go again. Another wannabe claiming importance. Officer, do your job. Remove him. The officers stepped closer. One reached for Sundar's arm, but the young woman quickly interjected, her voice trembling but urgent. Please. Just listen to him. Something about this doesn't feel right. The officer paused, annoyed but momentarily swayed. Sir, he said firmly, you need to either show us identification or come with us to the station. Sundar looked down at his hands, then back at the crowd. He spoke, his voice calm but strong, carrying a weight that silenced the murmurs. All day I've been sitting outside these doors. I was denied entry because I didn't have a badge. I watched a young woman humiliated by her boss. I saw laughter at someone else's expense, and I heard employees cry out about stress, about not being seen, about being invisible. Do you know why I stayed? Because I wanted to feel at bay. I wanted to know what happens when power doesn't walk in with a name tag or a title. The crowd shifted uneasily. Some looked ashamed, others skeptical. The supervisor rolled his eyes. What nonsense. Sundar reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. He held it slowly, deliberately, as though unveiling something sacred. He opened it and it showed the officer his identification card. The officer leaned closer, his eyes narrowing, then widening. He froze. His partner looked over his shoulder, then stiffened. A gasp rippled through the crowd. The card was unmistakable. It bore Sundar's name, his photograph, and the title everyone. In the company knew, Chief Executive Officer. The young woman's hands flew to her mouth in shock. The janitor's lips curved into a knowing smile, as though his suspicions had just been confirmed. The guards stepped back, their faces pale. The supervisor's smirk shattered, replaced by a look of horror. No, he whispered, his voice cracking. This can't be. The taller officer cleared his throat, suddenly formal. Sir, forgive us. We didn't know. But Sundar raised his hand, stopping him. His gaze swept the entire crowd, guards, supervisors, employees, even the strangers who had mocked him earlier. His eyes carried no malice, only a profound sadness. You didn't know because you didn't care to see, he said quietly. You looked at me and decided I was a problem. You heard my name and thought I was lying. You saw a man without a badge, and you forgot he was still a human being. The words hit harder than any shout could have. The crowd fell into silence. People avoided his eyes, some shifting uncomfortably, some looking down in shame. Then Sundar turned to the young woman and the janitor. But two of you saw differently. You saw a person, not a threat. You defended a stranger, even when you had nothing to gain. That is what this company should stand for. Not arrogance, not dismissal, but kindness, respect, and courage. The young woman's eyes filled with tears. The janitor nodded sullenly, his silence more powerful than any words. Sundar let the silence stretch, knowing it would etch itself into their memories. Then he said, Today I came without power. Without title, without privilege. And what I found was truth about how far we've drifted from our values. This will change, starting now. The crowd felt the gravity of his words. Whispers rippled again, but this time they carried awe rather than mockery. And just as the moment reached its peak, another voice pierced through a shaky Panic shout from an employee who came running out of the building. It's getting worse inside. People are demanding answers. They're saying if leadership doesn't face them right now, they'll walk out. All eyes turned to Sundar. The flashing lights painted his face in red and blue, but his eyes burned. With a steady fire, this was no longer just about a misunderstanding at the gate. It was about the very survival of trust within the company. Sundar straightened his shoulders, his voice calm but resolute. Then it's time I walked back in. Asterisk the moment Sundar uttered the words. Then it's time I walked back in. The atmosphere outside the googleplex shifted. The guards, the supervisor, even the police officers instinctively stepped aside, their authority evaporating in the face of the quiet power in his voice. The employees who just minutes earlier had whispered about him as if he were a nuisance now stared at him in awe, guilt, and anticipation. Some pulled out their phones, recording the scene, while others remained frozen, uncertain of what would happen next. Sundar single quotes as footsteps were slow but steady as he crossed the threshold into the building. The glass doors slid open as if bowing to his return, yet he carried no pride in his stride. He walked not like a CEO reclaiming control, but like a man stepping into a house that had lost its soul and needed it restored. Behind him, the crowd followed guards, officers, the young woman, the janitor, and dozens of employees who wanted to see what would happen when their leader faced them, not from a stage. But from the ground they all stood upon. Inside, the conference hall was chaos. The large screen still glowed with half-finished slides. The floor littered with abandoned papers, half-empty coffee cups, and the weight of panic. An executive was being wheeled out by paramedics, his face pale, his body limp. Employees stood in clusters, some arguing, some shouting, many with eyes red from stress and exhaustion. The slogans on the walls, respect each other, create with kindness, don't be evil, seemed almost mocking in that moment. Their glossy polish unable to hide the cracks in reality. When Sundar entered, the noise faltered, then softened, until silence spread like ripples on water. People turned, eyes widening, jaws dropping. Recognition swept the room like wildfire. It's him, someone whispered. Sundar Pichai. Another gasp. A hush settled so thick that even the hum of the overhead lights seemed louder than the crowd. Sundar walked to the front, stopping where the fallen executive had stood just minutes earlier. He looked around, meeting the eyes of his employees, some filled with shame, others with defiance, many with raw desperation. He didn't start with authority. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he spoke softly, and because the room was so quiet, every word carried. This morning, I came here without a badge, without a car, without an assistant, without anything that told the world who I was. I wanted to see what this company had become when no one knew my name. What I found was pain. I was denied entry. I was treated as a problem. I was mocked, doubted, and almost arrested outside my own building. A ripple of unease passed through the room. Employees exchanged nervous glances, some biting their lips, others lowering their heads. Sundar's gaze didn't waver, but that wasn't the hardest part, he continued. The hardest part was hearing you, hearing the exhaustion in your voices, the anger, the hurt, hearing that you feel invisible, that you feel unseen by the very company you give your lives to. I saw a young woman humiliated in front of her peers. I saw laughter at someone else's expense. I saw arrogance, dismissal, and fear. And I realized, somewhere along the way, we forgot what made us who we are. His words sank into the silence like stones into water. Some employees wiped their eyes quietly. The young woman who had defended him outside stood near the doorway, tears streaming freely down her cheeks. The janitor leaned against his mop, nodding slowly as if every word was a truth he had carried for years. Sundar paused, letting the weight of his words settle before continuing. We are not just a company. We are people who dreamed big enough to change the world. But dreams mean nothing if we lose sight of the humanity in each other. It doesn't matter how powerful our technology becomes. how many billions we earn, or how far our reach extends. If we can't treat the person beside us with kindness, then we've already failed. A murmur of agreement rippled through the hall. Sundar's voice grew steadier, though never raised. Today, I stood outside as a stranger. Tomorrow, I will stand inside as your CEO. But my promise to you is this: we will change, not with slogans, not with posters, but with actions. Managers will listen. Executives will be held accountable. No one, no matter their title, will be allowed to treat another human being with cruelty or indifference. And if you are exhausted, if you are overwhelmed, your voice will be heard, not silenced. The room trembled with unspoken emotion. People who had felt invisible for years suddenly felt seen. Those who had hidden their pain behind forced smiles now let tears slip freely. Then Sundar's eyes softened. He looked toward the janitor and the young woman, raising his hand toward them. Two people reminded me today what matters most. One spoke up when she could have stayed silent. The other saw me when everyone else looked away. They showed courage, humility, and respect, values that should define all of us. If this company is to survive, it will survive because of people like them, people who choose kindness over cruelty, respect over arrogance, humanity over pride. The applause began, softly, uncertainly, like raindrops. Then it grew louder and louder until the hall thundered with it. Not the polite applause of employees clapping for a speech, but the raw, unrestrained applause of people who felt a spark reignite in their hearts. Sundar didn't smile. He didn't bask in it. He only nodded, his face solemn. Today, you saw me as a man without a badge. Remember that feeling. Remember what it taught you. Because the future of Google will not be built by titles or power. It will be built by how we treat each other when no one is watching. The applause turned into a standing ovation. Tears streaked faces, hands clapped until they were sore. And for the first time in a long time, hope spread through the building like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. But amid the applause, Sundar's eyes lingered on the fallen executive being wheeled away. And he whispered to himself, unheard by anyone else, let this never happen again. And as he stepped down from the stage, walking not as a CEO, but as one of them, the story of that day, the day the CEO was denied entry to his own company, would live on forever as a lesson, a warning and a promise.